Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to 1986. Remember in 1985 I was talking about how it was kind of the eye of the storm, and in 86 things were going to pick right back up again like they were in 84, where everything was crazy, the experimentation was really high, the amount of ideas that were floating around bumping into each other was really, really high, and so it was hard to gauge what genres were doing what and how they were blending together, how they were evolving, because there was just so much going on. 86 is just like that again, and I bet you 87, 88, 89, and so forth are going to be that way too. So let's strap in, shall we? Before we get going, a little bit of a reminder, all the tracks that I talk about on this episode are going to be in my Essential playlist for this year, and then if you want to listen to the rest of these albums that are on my Essentials, or the Conspicuous Absences, or all the other albums that I decided to keep for 1986, that's in my bigger list. Both of them are linked in the description of this episode. Okay, so what are we talking about today? As always, what's moving in, what's moving out, what is hot right now as far as musical trends, as well my essential albums for this year and why. I hit the maximum this year. I hit 20. It was a really hard choice, but we'll talk more about that as we go along. And then my conspicuous absences, I also hit my limit. And there's more to talk about beyond that. But also, why were they conspicuous? Why were they absent from my list, and why? So there's a lot to talk about there for sure. So let's get started. Music trends. What's moving in? Electronica is still moving in. I think that this year, compared to last year, a lot of those distinctive subgenres are starting to take shape even more so. We'll talk about that as we get into the essential albums for this year, where I think the beginnings of house are starting to take shape, turntablism, IDM, EDM, all of those different subgenres of electronica are starting to form up even more, and they're becoming a little bit more familiar to us compared to when they are at their peak. So I think a lot of those DJs and those electronica artists are really starting to find their footing. But it's not quite on trend. I don't think that electronica is necessarily going to be on trend for several more years, but it's getting closer. Next, video game music. So remember last year where we talked about how in 1987, I'm going to start doing a video game music check-in? Well, it's still happening. But having said that, 1985 was when Super Mario Brothers came out, and I would say that that was the first huge introduction to the general population about video games and, by extension, video game music. I think most people in society know most of the themes to Super Mario Brothers. So that was 1985. In 1986, we got The Legend of Zelda, and we got Dragon Quest for Japan, or as we know it, Dragon Warrior, which is a role-playing game. Those two are probably the biggest hits of that year from a music perspective, but we're not going to necessarily talk about them in greater detail, just sort of giving you an understanding. And then in 1987, when we actually do a video game music check-in, I think is when a lot of these composers that are making the music for these games really start to understand how they can use the tools available to them in order to make quality music for the limited space that they have on these video game cartridges. And the great thing about video game music is how these composers figure out how to stretch the boundaries of what's possible with the limited memory that they have available to them on these game discs or video game cartridges. So we're going to talk about that even more when we actually start to do the check-in. But video game music is definitely moving in. It probably will hit a peak for a little while in the 90s, and then it'll sort of level off. But for right now, it's still moving in. Next, alt country. So alternative country, or alt country as it's called, is a subgenre of country which has a very broad definition, kind of like alternative rock does, but alt country in this case is supposed to be the juxtaposition to neo-traditionalist country, which we've been talking about a little bit here and there with like the Judds and Reba McEntire. That's neo-traditionalist country. Alt country, which I highlight a little bit this year and a little bit next year, has some big players in it, like Lyle Lovett is a really big example of alt country. You know, it's a little bit more, interestingly enough, a traditional sound of country versus what is called neo-traditionalist country. The definitions are all kind of strange, but stick with me when we're talking about some of these examples and you'll find it. Next, neo-psychedelic rock. We've been talking about neo-psychedelic rock being on the way in for a year or two at this point. It's still on the way in. It's not quite there yet. Neo-psychedelic rock, I would say, doesn't peak for several more years, but it's still moving in steadily. More examples coming our way. And then finally, gangsta rap. So gangsta rap is almost on trend in 1986. I would say by 87, it's officially going to push golden age of rap all the way out, but not quite yet. It's still, I would say, finding its footing and moving in still. But this year it moves ahead by leaps and bounds and is really starting to make a play for the top of the mountain for sure. So what's happening right now? Neo-Traditionalist Country, as we've been talking about, as I was discussing in 85, there probably needed to be one or two more big hits in order to really push Neo-Traditionalist Country to the top of the mountain. And this year, I think it happened. And we'll talk about that as we get to our essentials. Additionally, what I'm calling pop R&B, which is juxtaposed to what the earlier iteration of contemporary R&B was, which was more post-disco contemporary R&B. This is more like pop R&B if you want to think about how Shaka Khan was pushing us towards pop R&B, or Pointer Sisters. That was more pop R&B and less strictly post-disco contemporary R&B. The reality is that it's just a different way of talking about how R&B, rhythm and blues, continues to evolve over time, even if it's kind of always called the same thing, which is just R&B. So when we talk about pop R&B, we're just talking about this latest iteration of what's going on with the world of R&B at the time. And eventually we'll have to come up with a whole new name, like post-pop R&B or something. We'll figure it out. It's on trend. It's sort of pushed out even the old idea of Thriller, for example, or pushed out the ideas of Off the Wall by Michael Jackson, or some earlier Shaka Khan. All that stuff is getting pushed out in favor of this new pop R&B idea. And we'll talk about that again in greater detail when we get to the list. Also, hair metal. Hair metal is still very much on trend. It's still navigating its way across the flat plateau of being on top. There's still a lot of juice left to squeeze on this one. We'll talk more about that when we get to the essentials, but it's still on trend. And then the golden age of rap, I would say, is almost done. Like I was saying, gangster rap is nearly at the cusp of just knocking it all the way off the mountain. It's teetering on the edge right now, which is a sad thing to see because Run DMC has been a bounty of joy for all of us. And it's going to be sad when they eventually get knocked off the perch by other artists coming in, talking about different subjects than perhaps Run DMC and the like have been comfortable rapping about previously. Like, if you hear some of the stuff that we're going to talk about this year, it's in no way sounds like what Curtis Blow was doing. It's going to be wild stuff. What's moving out? City pop is still moving out. It's probably going to be moving out for quite a bit longer before it officially gets knocked off. I think there's a few different albums that are going to come out over the next several years that are going to essentially erase the idea of city pop being popular from existence, but not quite yet. And then post-disco contemporary R&B, like I said, pop R&B is really doing its work in order to knock that older idea of contemporary R&B off, and it's almost over. I would say give it another year or two and it'll be over for sure. Okay, that was a lot of trends, huh? Right? 1986 is extremely busy, don't you think? Now we're going to actually talk about the essential albums for this year and why, and there's a lot to talk about here. First, African Bambaataa, Planet Rock, the album. It's rap, it's turntablism, I would even say it's electronica. There's a lot of experimentation going on in this album, specifically Planet Rock, the track, and then Looking for the Perfect Beat. Both of them are clear signs that not only is rap highly on trend right now, and that it's continuing to evolve out of its initial phases into something else, but that the degree of experimentation that African Bambaataa and his crew are working with in this album shows that there's a comfort level with what was or has been with rap, and they're pushing the envelope far on this one. Like Looking for the Perfect Beat, to me, is a highly experimentational approach to both turntablism and infusing a lot of electronica in there. And certainly there is a rap component, but African Bambaataa is clearly pushing the envelope on what rap means and what it can mean, way beyond the bounds of just strictly, we're doing the golden age of rap thing, we're doing rap battling thing. He's moving way beyond that, which is really exciting. If you haven't listened to it for a while, or you've never listened to African Bambaataa for whatever reason, or Planet Rock, check out that track, and then also Looking for the Perfect Beat. Those are really good examples of the high degree of experimentation that's happening now that rap is firmly planted at the top as an idea in people's understanding and awareness. People are comfortable with what it is, an understanding of what it could be, and so because of that, he's just pushing the envelope. It's really great stuff. Speaking of really great stuff, next, Beastie Boys' License to Ill. This to me is one of the clearest signs that golden age of rap is almost over, because it's so perfectly golden age of rap, and yet there's so many clear elements of gangster rap that they're throwing in there that they're just bringing so much life and vibrance to the rap genre. Like, it's produced immaculately, like it's produced so well. I mean, it's insane how well it's produced. Ad Rock, MCA, and Mike D, who are the Beastie Boys, do an excellent job of executing this album. There is a clarity around gangster rap. Like, they've added a lot of polish into some of those gangster rap elements. They're talking about lots of vulgar topics. They're talking about violence. They're talking about committing crime. They do the female disrespect thing. They're telling a lot of stories about their life in a gangster capacity, which I don't necessarily perceive that they are hardcore gangsters like they purport to be in the album, which is kind of funny. To me, it's always going to be one of the funniest pivots in music history, where you were going in this very clear direction with so many of the albums that have come before that we talk about, you know, Grandmaster Flash, we talk about Curtis Blow, even Fat Boys, Houdini, like Run DMC. And then all of a sudden, Beastie Boys come out of nowhere and they sound so polished. Their rhymes are so clear, right? Their bars are so clear, and they're just coming across so well. And they somehow at the same time are going real hard and also completely self-effacing with almost everything that they're saying. Like, they're not taking themselves very seriously, and yet they're encouraging you to take them seriously, but only in kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of way. This album is genius. I don't think that anybody would ever say that the Beastie Boys weren't genius. License to Ill is 85 to 90% hits. Like Rhymin' and Stealin', The New Style, She's Crafty, and Brass Monkey are the four that I called out, but almost all the tracks on this album are hits, period. The one I want to call out specifically is The New Style, which I think a lot of people would call out if they were rap historians and wanting to talk about the transition from golden age of rap to gangster rap. The New Style as a track has totally transcended DJing in it. The first half of it is pretty straight ahead golden age of rap. And then the second half, where they're basically going to talk about dropping the beat, and then they drop the beat, and then they go into a completely different cadence, and the DJing changes completely. That new style that happens in the second half of the track is the new way that we're going to start approaching backtracks going forward. You know, it's really hard. It's got a huge bass to it. That whole approach, was ushering in gangster rap styles. It also was ushering in pop rap styles that I don't think were necessarily all the way crafted just yet. And so give that one a listen at the very least. I mean, Rhymin' and Stealin's amazing. The New Style's amazing. She's Crafty is a pop hit. Brass Monkey's also a pop hit. Girls is on there too. There's No Sleep Till Brooklyn. Like, there's a ton of hits. Like I said, it's almost all hits on this album. And if you've ever heard the Beastie Boys, you've heard at least one of the tracks on this album, if not all of them, very well and often in your life. So this is a fundamental album to me, especially in the transition between golden age of rap and gangster rap. So give this whole album a listen, or just those 4 tracks I called out. Either way, it's amazing. Next, Big Black, Atomizer. So this is like avant-garde post-punk. I think actually the real definition of it is post-hardcore. That's like what the official genre is called. Here's the thing. Big Black is a little bit late to the party on this one. It's interesting and ambitious nonetheless. It's a highly intriguing album where you're taking some of that avant-garde and you're taking some of that post-punk, post-hardcore, and you're mobilizing it in really interesting directions and experimenting a lot. Jordan, Minnesota is one great track, Passing Complexion, and then Kerosene. All 3 are really excellent tracks in which Big Black is pushing a lot of the envelope around what is left to squeeze out of the punk movement, at least in this moment. And I would just give 1 or 2 of those a listen just so you can hear how far we've come from a post-punk perspective, because the avant-garde aspects of this really show you how we've torn apart some of those fundamental conventions of punk over the last several years, and how completely and utterly different this is than some of the stuff we were listening to in 1980, 1981 that we called post-punk. Even Joy Division. Listen to Unknown Pleasures compared to this. This is much further ahead in its understanding of what we can do with the genre, but, you know, never losing sight of the fact that I'm sure Unknown Pleasures was a direct influencer in work like this. So this is where it's gone so far. So give this stuff a listen so that you can continue to keep yourself grounded in where punk is at in this moment, because those little nuggets of punk are starting to fade away in favor of other ideas and other merging of genres. This is a little bit more on the pure side. You can detect that it's post-punk, but we're kind of starting to lose a few of those fundamentals in favor of just whatever's coming next. The new style, as they say, right? Next, Bon Jovi, Slippery When Wet. I think it probably would have been strange if we didn't include this, right? Because it's fundamental hair metal. You Give Love a Bad Name, Living on a Prayer, Wanted Dead or Alive. Those are their 3 monster hits that are on this album. There's a lot here that's great, though. If you haven't listened to the whole album, you can get a little bit more context with those 3 songs that are monster hits with the rest of the album, because it all kind of weaves together pretty well to give you that not only strong hair metal presence, but also honestly gives you a lot of Springsteen influences. It's not just because they're all kind of from the same place approximately. It's clear that Bon Jovi takes a lot of influences from Bruce Springsteen and takes his version of rock and roll and integrates it into hair metal in order to create even more poppy sounds, which I think is kind of interesting because they're both rock or metal elements. But it all kind of works. It's really great stuff. Where I've previously been kind of tepid on hair metal, this is a really great album just because of how effective it is at delivering pop hooks in this hair metal context where I think Def Leppard was still just trying to figure it out with Pyromania. Bon Jovi's really figured it out with their sound. And I do think, too, in direct or indirect or accidental or purposeful connections, that what Rat did out of the cellar previously has kind of also led us to this moment where Bon Jovi has some inspiration or directionality, where it's possible that they are in no way related to each other. But I'd like to believe that Rat coming out with their album made it more possible for general listeners to be open to the idea of Slippery When Wet as an album, which put Bon Jovi into the place that he and the band have been for 40 years. So kudos to Rat, certainly, to bring us to this accessible moment, and Bon Jovi kind of continues to carry us further along with hair metal being on top, but it's just really great stuff. Give it a listen. Another amazing album, Dwight Yoakam, guitars, Cadillacs, etc., etc. And that's actually what the name of the album is. I'm not just being glib about it. It's honky tonk, for sure, because that's like his thing. His thing is honky tonk and yodeling, but it's also neo-traditionalist country. It's pretty poppy. It's kind of accessible. Specifically, Honky Tonk Man and Guitars, Cadillacs, both of them are great examples of really accessible neo-traditionalist country. This, to me, was that last album that needed to kick neo-traditionalist country up onto the top of the mountain. Because Dwight Yoakam is such a talent. It's ridiculous how talented he is. He's so good at threading that needle between being actually traditional or even alt country, doing the honky tonk thing, and also being neo-traditionalist and accessible. He'd be played on the radio continuously, much like Reba McEntire. Reba McEntire is highly skilled as a singer, but also highly consumable at the same time. Dwight Yoakam is just a light in the darkness sometimes. He is such a talent. He's tremendous. And I can't recommend his work enough, especially this album. It's his first album. He just really explodes out there. Honky Tonk Man, great track. Just enjoy that. Next, Janet Jackson, Control. This is that pop R&B sound that is just that next iteration of contemporary R&B. I think it's really interesting that Janet Jackson shot out ahead here of, not to say it's a competition between her and Michael Jackson, but, you know, Michael Jackson came out with Thriller several years ago, and Bad will actually come out next year. But Janet Jackson got out in front of that with Control, showing the next evolution of where R&B is going to go. Like Nasty, What Have You Done For Me Lately, Pleasure Principle, When I Think of You. All 4 of those tracks are distinctly different from each other, which is astounding. Like, the instrumentation is totally different. The topics are kind of all in the same space because she has a very short list of topics that she likes to talk about, most of which have to do with, let's just say, pleasure principle, nasty, things like that, relationships. And so because of that, they're all definitely Janet Jackson's vibe, but she just approaches this in such an ambitious way. I mean, the fact that the first track, which is sort of an intro track, which is usually my least favorite thing in an album, it explains that she is in control of this music and she's directing its future. So as a result, all throughout this album, you're constantly going back to this idea that she's in control of this and she's creating this stuff with her vision, which is amazing because at this time in music history, Michael Jackson was everywhere. He had consumed all of pop culture. He was already the king of pop. He was in charge. And the fact that Janet Jackson, in that noise, was able to leap out and express that this is her own thing, this isn't Michael Jackson, this is her, and it sounds distinctly like her, it doesn't sound like Michael Jackson in any way, is pretty amazing that she had the guts and the conviction to do that. It's amazing stuff. I would say that she is clearly the successor to Shaka Khan's ambition and pushing contemporary R&B even further into the experimental realms. It's really astounding stuff to listen to. Now, one thing I will say is that some of these tracks are a little long, so kind of this idea of having control. There could have been a little bit more editing on each track in order to make it a little bit shorter, but most of the beats that she's walking with, they all work, so you can kind of go on the 5-minute journey with her with most of this stuff. But could they be a little bit shorter? Totally. Either way, it definitely seems like this is her thing, and she's sharing it with everybody else, and it's a really lovely thing to see just because of how excellent it is, and again, how ambitious and courageous it was, considering that her brother is the biggest music icon ever, even in this moment. So that takes a lot of courage to do, and I honor her for that because it's amazing stuff. Next is Just Ice, Back to the Old School. This is definitely gangster rap for sure. I mean, I even think that Just Ice is considered to be like a grandfather or like one of the early tenets of like official gangster rap. And I agree. And that's having said, I learned that later. So I listened to Back to the Old School first without context, as I often do when I'm listening to this music in this project. And when I heard it, I went, oh yeah, this is just straight ahead gangster rap. There's no hints really here of golden age of rap. Like obviously there's tradition, so it's not like it's completely absent, but this is a total hard right from golden age of rap into gangster rap. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the turntablism is particularly noteworthy in this album for sure. And I'll talk about that here in a second. But the third thing that I want to bring up is that this to me sounds like the very early beginnings of what we call underground rap, which it's a little bit hard to describe, but it's very underground ideas. It's very, not beat poetry-esque, but it's very lo-fi, where it's just the rapper and like a minimal beat, and the rapper's just talking about really intense, highly dense topics that sound like prose or poetry in a way, or like reciting some really intense information or messages that they're imploring the listener to pay attention to, because they tend to be really heavy topics that the rappers are trying to get their message out to the listeners as much as they possibly can. And so I would say that this is an early iteration of what underground rap is in the late 90s, early 2000s. So Just Ice in this case is really out ahead with some of this stuff. Like gangster rap, clearly establishing that, great, nailed that. Turntablism, this is some of the best turntablism and DJing that we've experienced yet. And then the underground rap component, which this says to me that those underground rap artists in the late 90s and early 2000s were taking inspiration from Just Ice. So like all of that is amazing. So the one track I'm going to call out here, Cold Getting Dumb, is unbelievable DJ, period. The samples that are used, the breaks that are used, the skill at the turntable, all of it is phenomenal, and I would just give that one track a listen, because you listen to the backtrack, like, yeah, what Just Ice is doing is great, but the DJing is impeccable. And that's saying something, considering that we've got License to Ill this year, we've got Africa Bambaataa, Planet Rock this year. The DJing on this track is flawless. So give that one a listen just because of how excellent it is. You can give the rest of the album a listen too if you want to keep getting that flavor of the early markers of gangster rap and how it's almost overtaken golden age of rap if you want to. Cold Getting Dumb is crazy. So like give that one a listen for sure. Next, Love and Rockets Express. I would call it art rock, probably. It's uplifted Bauhaus. So Bauhaus, if you're not familiar with it, is a band that was fairly popular in the 70s and early 80s. We didn't really talk about it very much because they weren't doing a lot that I was necessarily interested in keeping, but they were early emo, early goth rock, the first iteration of it. It's really interesting stuff, especially this year, because the reason I bring up Bauhaus is that several of the artists that were from Bauhaus are in Love and Rockets, so it's sort of a new iteration for them. And what they've decided to do is something, as I said, a little bit more uplifted than the sort of straight ahead goth rock or emo approach. So it's really accessible. But the interesting thing is that if you take those goth rock elements and the emo elements, it kind of turns into art rock a little bit. It's not alternative, that's for sure. It's its own variety of rock music. The thing I would also talk about is comparing what Love and Rockets did post Bauhaus and what The Cure did to evolve out of their emo, I would say pseudo Paisley rock moment back in 1979 and in 1980. And they're finding themselves in a much more accessible place now. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a given that The Cure's evolution has somehow inspired Love and Rockets, because I'm pretty sure that they did their own thing. But It Could Be Sunshine, Kundalini Express, all in my mind, Yin and Yang. All four of those are excellent tracks that show this evolution. And if you're interested in going back and listening to Bauhaus, they're not on my big lists for any of these years. But if you want to go back and are curious and just listen to what Bauhaus was doing at the beginning of their career and their peak, and then listening to this, you could really hear how they've softened up a lot. They've become a lot more melodic. They've become a lot more consumable and accessible as a result. This is just really great stuff in which there's high experimentation, high accessibility, and I will always call out the bravery necessary in order to pivot hard on existing inspirations into different ones, trying it out and see if it sticks, because that takes a lot of humility to decide that you're going to go in these different highly experimental directions from what has more than likely worked for you in the past, especially with Bauhaus. So give it a listen. If it's your vibe, great. Keep listening. If it's not, fine. No problem. But, at least give it a chance. Next, Mantronix, Music Madness. This to me is dance rap. I would even classify it as pre-house music. As we were talking about this evolution of how rap and turntablism inevitably leads to house, this is another one of those little half steps forward that brings us closer to that moment of house becoming what it is in the late 80s, early 90s. This is another one of those steps forward, and we're going to keep seeing these little steps, these little inching steps forward away from strict turntablism and what was previously rap, and even dance rap, towards house music and electronica and things like that. So it's very exciting stuff. The tracks Who Is It and Big Band B-Boy, both are very clearly on-trend rap/hip hop. But at the same time, there's this little slice off that they're clearly defining of dance rap as a subgenre that eventually does, as I said, go into house, pre-house, and things like that. It's really interesting to see in this moment how I think some kind of slice was made between where Mantronix lives and where other rap artists live, and that slice happened, and they're just starting to separate from each other like icebergs. They're separating and separating and separating, and you could start to see that there's a distinction between the two sides more and more as you listen to these two tracks. It's really cool stuff. Also, I'm going to call it the album cover. The album cover is amazing, and you should just really take a look at the artistry there, because it speaks so much to where we're going. I would say for the remainder of the 80s, it's sort of like the video game-esque approach. It's just a really good call out to see, compare this album cover to Curtis Blow's first album cover or The Message's album cover. They're distinctly different, right? I think that this sort of dance rap pre-house thing is starting to distinguish itself, and this is another one of those steps forward. So give those two tracks a listen. They're both really great. Next, Megadeth. Peace sells, but who's buying? It's doom metal. It's really cool stuff. The great thing about doom metal in these early days, as I've said previously, is we haven't gotten to the guttural shouting into the microphone yet. And so because of that, I could still kind of understand what they're saying, which makes me happy, because one of the really sad things that I experience as we get later and later and later into doom metal and death metal and stuff is I lose the ability to understand what the singers are saying. And so it makes it really challenging for me to really appreciate it all the way. So we're still in the moment where bands like Megadeth are making it accessible for me to hear what they're singing about, which makes me really happy. Just calling out Venom and Metallica here because they've led us to this moment. It's really great stuff. Wake Up Dead, first of all, is a really funny track name, and the whole track itself is really entertaining and excellent. I would say that Megadeth, at least a little bit, is tongue-in-cheek just because Wake Up Dead is such a silly, ironic song title. And Peace sells, but who's buying? All of that says to me that there's punk roots in there, that the irony is thick, the irreverence is thick. So seeing albums like this really helps show you also where punk rock has taken us, specifically to moments like this, that in these late days of the early iterations of punk rock or post-punk or what have you, leading to doom metal in this case, you can see those connections because there's still some things that are hanging on, like the irony or the tongue-in-cheek components or the irreverence, and we're not just singing strictly about highly serious doom and death things just yet. It's still a little bit ironic, which is really fun. It's a really great album. Really enjoy it. Wake Up Dead is a great track. I would give that one a listen. If you like the rest of it and you like the vibe, keep going. It's all good stuff. I really enjoy it. Next, Metallica's back. Whew, thank goodness. Master of Puppets. I think that if I hadn't included Master of Puppets, I probably would have had a lot of hate mail sent my way. Because Ride the Lightning wasn't my favorite. Kill 'Em All was excellent, and then they, kind of went down. And then Master of Puppets is a pinnacle for them. It's a peak. It's speed metal. It's their speed metal. They own the speed metal. It's them. Battery and Master of Puppets, both of those tracks are unbelievable. This is their best yet. They're so polished. Whatever happened with Ride the Lightning, I don't know. Like, it's almost as if that it didn't go exactly in the directions that they were exploring in Kill 'Em All. Like, somehow they took it personally and they aggressively rediscovered where they wanted to go with this, and then they came out on top. I'm not totally sure. It seems like the time between Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, I perceive with no knowledge whatsoever that they must have come back together and said, okay, we learned a lot in the first two albums. Let's take the things that we thought sounded really excellent and try and just punch those up to the maximum that we possibly can and just do that going forward. So there's a little bit less experimentation than they have previously, because I think that they're more established at this point. So they're not experimenting as aggressively as they were, but they've found the things that really work for them and they're just riding that out. So this to me is masterful Metallica. They're super confident. They know exactly what they're trying to do. Their speed metal, like the guitar work is impeccable as usual from them. This is just really great stuff. Master of Puppets, super long track, but great. Can't deny that. It's really excellent. Give that one a listen. And Battery. Battery is really great too. So give them both a listen. Next, Nancy Griffith, The Last of the True Believers. This I call alt country. I don't necessarily think it's neo-traditionalist country, even though I could easily see it being classified as such. It's a little bit of both. The two tracks, Last of the True Believers and then Love at the Five and Dime. Here's the thing about Nancy Griffith, which I find to be so intriguing, is that, yeah, she's from Texas, but she's got a Celtic way about singing and how she crafts her songs that you never can totally tell if she's Southern country or if she's taking a lot of the Celtic traditional approaches to ballads and taking a country direction to them. Sometimes with her, and it's her specifically, you can never really tell, is she starting from Celtic traditions and going country, or is she country and going in Celtic traditions directions? She merges and fuses them and plays around with both of them so much at the same time, it's really hard to tell. And I think that that's what makes her distinctive and unique and wonderful. She's one of my favorite country artists, and she stands the test of time. I mean, even in the 2020s, 2010s, she's still putting out great stuff. So, I mean, she's one of the heavy hitters of, I would classify, alt country. Totally amazing talent, totally iconic, totally evergreen. Like, Nancy Griffith is fantastic. If you've never heard her before, then check her out. Last of the True Believers is a great track, as well as Love at the Five and Dime. Love at the Five and Dime, I would say, is more neo-traditionalist country. So if you're looking more for how does she blend the two a little bit more, Last of the True Believers, I would say, is Celtic traditions that pivots into country, and Love at the Five and Dime goes the other direction. So you can get a flavor of kind of both ways of going about it. It's really interesting stuff. She fuses those two genres together so impeccably. It's quite astounding to listen to. She's a tremendous talent, so give her a listen. Next, talk about a tremendous talent, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. This is the first time that I've ever regarded Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and I'll probably intermittently regard them as we go along here, because according to most music experts, Nick Cave has like 7,000 five-star albums all in a row, because he's just a tremendous talent. I would classify at least this album as art rock or even post-rock. It's definitely Nick Cave's version of rock, however we want to define that. That probably is a good example of why he's so popular in so many music listening circles, is because he's got his own way of doing things that is extraordinarily high in experimentation. He's playing with a million ideas and he's committed to like none of them because he's got a million of them. And he's generating inspiration for countless artists for decades, just because, kind of like Sparks, he's just playing with ideas and just letting them go into the ether, because he'll come up with a million more ideas in about 10 minutes. So there's no real reason for him to commit to anything for very long, because he's got endless amounts of ideas. Your Funeral, My Trial, that's the first track, and then Jack's Shadow, both of which are excellent examples of, again, this high degree of experimentation, this Sparks-like experimentation of alternative rock / post rock versus Sparks, which is more new wave synth. This is like if you took REM and was just playing around with every convention that any of the songs that REM have ever put out holds dear, and just says, yeah, but what if we do this, take this little piece here and then we just completely turn it on its head, or take this piece and instead of playing with electric guitars, play it with bass guitars, or singing about this, we're going to sing about that now. There's just too many ideas here to count. It's almost hard to keep track of all of the ideas that he's putting out there, because obviously he weaves all these crazy ideas together into something that's totally listenable and consumable, which is, I think, the genius of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds in this case. Give those 2 tracks a listen and see if it's your vibe. I know it's not like the most accessible, consumable thing that we've got on this list this year, but a Nick Cave education, I think, is always fundamental for, avid music listeners, just because, again, it's like sparks. There's so many ideas, so many influences that they're throwing out there that it's nice to hear some of the origin points that other artists were consuming in order to get their own inspiration. And Nick Cave is one of those excellent examples, so give him a listen. Speaking of REM, Life's Rich Pageant. We've had so many REM albums on our essentials list at this point because they're all great. And REM somehow continues to be out in front of the alternative rock movement, continuing to make hits, continuing to drive the genre forward, astoundingly, because normally what happens in a lot of these movements, especially big giant ones like alternative rock or like punk rock, there's a lot of artists that are out there, out in front, jockeying for a position. And REM is just way out there, but they're still continuing to push themselves and evolve and grow, which is really amazing to see too, because they probably could have rested on their laurels like 3 albums ago, and they would have been fine, but they haven't. They continue to push themselves. They continue to ask themselves how they can continue to evolve this idea and these sounds and grow and give more inspiration to other burgeoning alternative artists, competitive alternative rock artists, giving them some directionality on, hey, maybe use these ideas, or try doing this, or we're playing with this idea of softening it up even more in these particular areas and making it even more melodic. What about that? And it's just amazing to see. Begin the Begin and Fall on Me are 2 really excellent tracks in which they are continuing to make the genre even more accessible, even more melodic. They're both nearly pop tracks with how consumable they are. It's really great stuff. REM continues to be a treasure and will be a treasure forever and ever. Amen. I mean, REM is one of the great pinnacles of the 80s for sure. So give those 2 tracks a listen and honor the greatness. Next, talk about a pinnacle, Run DMC, Raising Hell. I would say that we're starting to get towards the end of the golden age of rap, as I've said previously, and in that regard, Run DMC's time with us is coming to a close, unfortunately. Reverend Run and DMC have been tremendous talents, and Jam Master Jay have been absolutely tremendous. I feel like I'm at their wake, which is sad because they're all still here. But Run DMC is eternal, right? So it's not like they're ever going to necessarily go all the way away. But Peter Piper, It's Tricky, and then Walk This Way, which was a collaboration with Aerosmith. I think we've all kind of heard Walk This Way at this point, both the Aerosmith track and also the rap track, both of which are great. So this to me, though, is that sign, because Run DMC at this point is starting to try and a little bit take some of those gangster rap elements that have been bubbling up to the surface for the last year or two, and they're sort of trying to infuse a little bit of that into their raps, but it's still so firmly grounded in the golden age of rap that I just honestly don't think that once we get to 1987, they know what's hitting them, because 1987 is kind of a marquee year for rap, and then 88 and 89. I mean, golden age of rap's time is about over, but this I would say is that last great moment for Run DMC in the golden age of rap, just putting everything out there that they can and really showing where rap can go before golden age starts to sundown a little bit. So give that one a listen, because, Walk This Way is really fun. It's Tricky is one of their biggest tracks that they ever had. And then Peter Piper is just really fun to listen to. It's really great lyrics. They're really great at attacking the bars. Like, it's really great stuff. So give that one a listen. Next, Susie and the Banshees, Tinderbox. So Susie Sue has been kind of weaving in and out of trying to get to the surface here for the last couple of years. Tinderbox is a peak moment, at least in my estimation, for them. This I would call alternative rock, though that is a little bit debatable. I think that they're pushing some boundaries beyond just strict alternative rock here, which also shows that alternative rock continues to be on the top of the mountain, because Susie and the Banshees are pushing some envelopes here on where they can go next with this sound. It's really great stuff. And they're also fusing a lot of other earlier ideas too. Like, there's a lot of influences from the B-52s, it sounds like, Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac. You can hear all this stuff in there. And clearly this album that they're putting out with Candyman, Sweetest Chili, and Cities and Dust is a gateway to later 90s rock sounds. So if you want to hear where we're eventually going to go with the 90s, give this album, those 3 tracks specifically, a listen, because this is, I would say, another example of how alternative rock is going to evolve out of this REM state into its next iteration, which I would say Susie and the Banshees is out in front of a little bit, trying to push some envelopes. Even if they're not on the tippy top like REM is, that everybody's paying attention to REM, Susie and the Banshees is trying to be more experimental, and they're trying to push in more experimental directions than REM is, because in REM's case, they're really just trying to see where their idea of alternative rock can go. Like, how did we make this idea of alternative rock be as consumable as possible? Susie and the Banshees is saying, we really like a lot of some of these alternative rock elements, but we're going to start infusing other ideas into it to see where's the next idea, where's the next big thing, because we want to start pursuing that. Next, Sonic Youth, Evol. It's alternative rock, certainly, but I would even call it pre-grunge. So the 2 tracks that I would call out, Tom Violence and Star Power. There's definitely a Fang connection here, so I'm calling out a Fang connection, right? Landshark, Fang, we talked about it several years ago. There is a connection to Fang in this album for sure. I do not know, and nor do I want to claim, that Sonic Youth was listening to Fang, and as a result, they were deeply inspired by this music and they made this album. But there are Fang elements in this album for sure. But you've also got rockabilly, you've got new wave, you got post-punk, you got alternative, it's pre-grunge. This album has a lot of genres shoved into it all at once, and as a result, it really does make you question a little bit exactly what alternative rock is and where it's going, because there are, like I said, grunge elements. There's all sorts of elements in here that are more forward-thinking than just strictly the alternative rock of this age. So give at least those 2 tracks a listen, Tom Violence and Star Power. They'll show you where alternative rock is going. It's going wherever they're going, for sure. Next, Squirrel Bait, Skag Heaven. Alternative rock. The 3 tracks I'm calling out specifically are Kid Dynamite, Virgil's Return, and Blacklight Poster Child. This is an interesting album for me because I've been keeping Husker Du and the Replacements on the outskirts for several years, some of which were in my big list, some of which I didn't even put into my big list, some of which have been conspicuous absences for a variety of reasons. This one I'm calling out specifically because I believe that it takes Husker Du / Bob Mould elements and the Replacements elements and putting it together into this more consumable alternative package that somehow works, which I think is really intriguing, that everything that I've perceived that either of those bands have somehow been missing to get to the level of being an essential album, I think that Squirrel Bait somehow manages to figure out how to put it all together and deliver this album to us. It's really interesting stuff. I would encourage you to listen to these 3 tracks and then probably listen to some of the Husker Du that has been either conspicuous absences or just on my big list and see how they line up to each other and go, yeah, okay, I can see how they're related. And maybe you perceive that Squirrel Bait is more accessible. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. All of those things are totally possible. But either way, I think this is a really great album to listen to. It's highly consumable. It's really enjoyable. And also, it is making you question kind of the direction, again, of where alternative rock is going, which is why alternative rock is still on top, but there's definitely a lot of energy around trying to figure out what happens next. So we're starting to see a lot of that experimentation for sure. Next, Talk Talk, The Color of Spring. This is another art rock album, kind of like Love and Rockets Express. This is art rock again. I called out several tracks in this album because this is a beautiful album. I consider it to be one of the best of the year, which is astounding again because like License to Ill is on my essentials this year. I mean, there's a lot of really amazing stuff in this year, so it's a hard choice to make, and I think it's totally subjective in this case. This is one of my favorite albums of the year, let's just say. It's like joyful Talking Heads. It's also kind of like soft rock, and I also think that they're evolving out of things like Tears for Fears and new wave and stuff, where new wave synth pop is long gone. It's definitely passé at this point. It might even be getting close to being put in the ground. Talk Talk in this case has done something tremendous with this album, launching itself from the ashes of new wave synth pop and Tears for Fears style late stage new wave synth pop into this beautiful, wonderful album that's not very long. Happiness is Easy, I Don't Believe in You, Life's What You Make It, Living in Another World. All 4 of those tracks are tremendous to me. They're all highly listenable. It's a wonderful album. Like I said, it's one of my favorites for the year. It's really great stuff. But like, don't sleep on any of these other albums because there's such a density of quality in this year. It's really hard to capture it all. This one just happens to be one of my favorites to go back and listen to every once in a while. And then finally, XTC, Skylarking. It's on the list after all these years. And you're probably going to say, SJ, why did it take you this long in order to put it on the list officially? Especially considering that in 79, you put it on your conspicuous absences, which was like offensive. Here's the thing. XTC, to me, has always been tremendous. Like, nobody's going to question how amazing and tremendous XTC has been, and also influential, because there's a lot of bands that have come along since then across 80, 81 to even 86 that sound a little bit like XTC and are taking a lot of those conventions. So I'm honoring all of that. Having said that, I believe that this album takes all of the great nuggets that they've captured and pulled together over the last several albums that they've had since even 79, and they've put it together into one whole entire album that works. Because I think that every single album that they've had, even since Drums and Wires in 79, has had one or two things that are great, and then a bunch of stuff that isn't so interesting, or is overly invested in very tiny ideas. And so because of that, the album itself is not all the way put together. I perceive this year, XTC Skylarking takes all of those really great elements together. It's like a best of all of their ideas and shoves it into one album, and that's why it's on this list. I define it as alternative rock, but I know that it goes way beyond that, and also it's still got elements from new wave and stuff way in the way back. But I think at this point, it's more like an alternative rock vibe than anything else. It just seems all the way cooked. The repetition is way down. The genius is hitting its peak. Grass, Ballad for a Rainy Day, and Mermaid Smile to me are, like I said, the best versions of things that they've done previously, but they're all in one album together. Mermaid Smile to me is one of my favorite tracks from this whole year. It's just really great stuff. So give that a listen. I mean, especially if you're a big XTC fan, like we finally got there. We finally put XTC on the list. Hooray! Let's all celebrate. Having said that, this is the whole list. It was 20 albums. Whew, that was a lot, wasn't it? Oh my goodness. So before we get into conspicuous absences, there's a couple things that I want to point out. One, just a reminder that Video Game Music Check-In is coming next year in 1987, so get ready for that. The second thing I want to mention before we get to conspicuous absences is that there were a ton of amazing albums this year. There were so many of them. It was really, really hard to define just a list of 20 essential albums for this year and why, and really nitpicking which ones I would pick over others. And the thing I'll tell you is that one of the reasons that I didn't put some of these albums that are on my big list on the essential albums is, like, if they had a really excellent album that comes right after a really excellent album that they had the prior year or the year before, and just not a lot changed between those two albums. There wasn't a lot of evolution. So that was one of the nitpicks that I had to make when I was thinking about the essential albums for this year. Like, if they had another really excellent album, but they just didn't evolve too much, you know, I kind of left it off the list this year just because the ambition wasn't the same compared to some of these other artists that are continuing to push themselves if they've been on the list a bunch of times, like REM or Run DMC, or they were just doing really innovative stuff, or it was like a first album for them and they were leaping out there onto the scene and just doing some really great music. So that was really the nitpick for this year. So if there's a bunch of stuff that I've missed on here, or even that I'm calling out as a conspicuous absence, I apologize. There's just so much good stuff here. It's crazy. All right, so conspicuous absences. First off, Cameo, Word Up. Here's the thing. The song is great. The ideas are super fun. But I just think that there's other R&B artists out there that are pushing the envelope further than them. Like, there's a little bit of that golden age of rap component, a teeny tiny little bit. The R&B elements are kind of there. You know, they got a little bit of a Shaka Khan thing going on. I just think that there's other R&B artists that are further out there. So it's a good album, but I think that there's more ambitious ones out there. Next, Cro-Mags, The Age of Quarrel. This one is, I would say, a lot of people's fundamental album for rock music. It is really excellent. I mean, not minimizing that at all. And it is varied. Like, there's a lot of different ideas there. But I also think that there's just some of the artists here on the alternative rock and, you know, grunge side that have just pushed more boundaries in more recent years than they have in this case. But it is great and it is fundamental. There's no two ways about it. But I think that they're a little bit behind. Like, maybe they didn't put out this album in time to sort of line up with where everybody else's ambition was in the moment. So it is what it is. Next, Shonen Knife, Pretty Little Baka Guy. Another great album. I mean, we did Shonen Knife a year or two ago, and They're still great. It's a great album. I just don't necessarily think that they've pushed as many boundaries as they did with Burning Farm from 1983. But the reason that I call it out is that Pretty Little Baka Guy was, I think, their actual hit in the Western world with Pretty Little Baka Guy. And so, considering that I put Burning Farm on the Essential list in 83, it would have made a lot of sense if I'd put this album in the Essentials for this year. But it's just not nearly as ambitious as Burning Farm was. I think it's more just that Pretty Little Baka Guy was everybody's introduction to them and didn't realize that they'd been doing this sort of stuff for the last several years. And then finally, this one will probably hurt a little bit to a bunch of people, but the Smiths, The Queen is Dead, right? You were sort of maybe waiting and listening to see if I brought that one up. It's a conspicuous absence. Here's the thing. The Smiths and Morrissey are both great. I completely acknowledge he and the band's influences in even the music that's happening right now that we're talking about in 1987. But I would say that Morrissey in this case is a little bit too fixated on his own ideas and his own greatness in order for this album to be all the way where it needs to be to go to the heights that it can possibly go to. I know The Queen is Dead is a totally fundamental, famous album, and so is Morrissey, obviously. And also, it's a huge influence in hundreds of thousands of bands that come along after that. But truth be told, I genuinely think that people have already taken some of his ideas and gone further with them because they're a little less committed to those specific ideas and just taking some of the influences and just riding them to the next level. And then similarly, people after him take some of these ideas and take it to the next level. But Morrissey's great. The Smiths are great. The Queen is Dead is also great, but I think he was just a little bit too committed to his own ideas and this one to take them further. Having said that, what did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Am I totally wrong about The Queen is Dead and I'm an insane person for not putting it on the Essentials list and I should have knocked off, I don't know, 11 Rockets or something? Maybe. It's totally possible. Like I said, this year was wild. The storm has kicked back up and I was knocked for a loop trying to figure out how to put this list together without there being like 50 essential albums on the list and boring everybody to tears. Because this episode is already pretty long, right? I'm sure you're looking at your watch saying, wow, this is a really long episode. There's a lot to talk about here. But what did you agree with? Do you love Dwight Yoakam? You should. Do you love Janet Jackson? You should. What about Just Ice? Did you ever hear him? Maybe. You should go listen to him more. He's really great. Did you think Megadeth did or didn't have connections to punk rock music and you already knew that? And you're like, SJ, I knew that already? Great. That's awesome. What do you think I missed? Probably a lot. I'm sure I missed something about 1986. It was a busy year. What did you learn? Did you learn anything this year? I mean, we're starting to really get into rap a lot. Are you learning anything about rap as we're going along? Or the many different facets of alternative rock and stuff like that? Or Nick Cave. Did you know about Nick Cave? Maybe. I mean, a lot of people know about Nick Cave. But if you want to go back and listen to some of this music, make sure to check out the Essential list. It's pretty long this year. I think it's like 3.5 hours because there's so much here. Check out the big list. It's really big too. It's the biggest list I've had so far. It's got like 900 some odd songs on there. It's a big list. Go check it out. Please join us again for 1987. 1987 I think is probably going to be just as crazy as 1986 was. So everybody pray for me. Make sure to go in and rate us and comment wherever you're listening. Make sure to find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on not only the episodes that we put out every Tuesday, but if we happen to put out special episodes, right? So make sure that you subscribe wherever you're listening to us. Make sure to tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your dog, cat, fish, goldfish, whatever. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to enjoy this music as best as we can, especially when we start to get into some of these more complicated years where the genres are all over the place and it's hard to really keep in your head where all these inspirations are going. And also, because of that, some of these artists are creating really, really ambitious stuff that might really challenge you as a listener to think about what do you like about music and what you don't like about it. Because at the end of the day, you are absolutely allowed to have preferences about what you like and don't like, and do that fearlessly. Because there's stuff that I like and don't like, and I listen to thousands of albums every month just doing this project. And I'm still asking myself these questions of why do I really like this? Why do I not like it? Why does this not resonate with me? Why does it connect with me? But I'm able to do that because I'm not scared of it. I'm not scared of learning something new. I'm not scared of engaging with this genre that I've never really given a chance to or never experienced before. It's just something new and novel that I'm experiencing. So don't forget that as you're listening to some of this stuff, and maybe you are or not familiar with it, that none of this stuff is scary. It's just music. Thanks for listening.